Good evening,
Okay.
everyone. Good morning to those in the Southern Hemisphere. We have, I can see, a large number there as well from Australia and New Zealand. My name's Alec Duffy. I work at Myer Grazing, work for Myer Grazing, and I'm joined tonight by Jack Kyle from Gallagher and also Cody Juvac from Gallagher as well. Tonight's presentation is all about starting a good grazing plan. It's purely an informative session to try and give people some tips and guidance around best practice when it comes to putting together a plan to help better manage your pastures and optimize production. A bit of background to Gallagher and Myer. We've been working together for the past 18 months, just about. There are a lot of synergies that exist between what we deliver in terms of software and grazing management, and obviously what Gallagher delivers in terms of the infrastructure, the tools, and also the on-ground expertise to help implement a lot of the strategy to better manage pastures and improve production. The format for this evening's webinar will be pretty simple. It's Jack delivering around a 45-minute presentation. There'll be time for questions at the end, so yeah, please raise your hand or submit in the chat box your questions to me, and then at the end of the presentation, I'll be able to ask those to Jack, and he'll be able to provide a response. This isn't a product-orientated webinar. It's really an informative session, so there'll only be a couple of minutes at the end talking about Myer Grazing as well, though all attendees will receive an email with a link to, for those Canadian attendees, to your closest Passion for Pastures dealer, likewise to the North American, and you'll also receive a link to the Myer Grazing website if you wanted to find out more information. But without further ado, I might hand over to you, Jack, to get things going.
Okay, thank you, Alex. So welcome to the webinar. We're going to talk tonight about starting a grazing plan and the components that go into a grazing plan and good grazing management. There's three main things that we want to look at in any grazing plan. First one is managing the forage. It's the forage that the producer is producing. The livestock are harvesting it, but it's the forage production is your limiting factor. So how do we manage the forage to optimize growth and productivity? We want to manage the soil. We want a good soil health, which promotes good forage growth. And then we want to manage the livestock so that they get the maximum benefit from the forage that we have produced. And just a quote here at the bottom of the screen from Jim Garish, who is one of the fellows I have great respect for in grazing management. An increase in cost and decrease in income is very often the outcome of not having a grazing plan. So kind of a negative way of putting it, but if you don't have a plan, you're going to have increased costs and decreased income, which is the opposite of what we want. And something I'd like you to keep in mind throughout this presentation and all the time when you're working with your pastures is the condition of the pasture when your livestock leave the pasture is key to keeping your pastures healthy. As I said at the beginning, we're managing the grass, and we want that grass to be in good condition when the animals leave the paddock so that it can quickly regrow. We've got a picture here of a pretty high stock density in a pasture that's way overgrazed. That grass is going to have a hard time recovering as to what its potential could be. So don't be looking so much at what the grass is like when you go in the paddock. It's what it's like when you move the animals out. So rotational grazing comes with a number of different names. Management intensive grazing, which was coined a number of years ago, where it's the management that's intensive in the grazing system, is the idea behind that. There's cell grazing, there's adaptive grazing, there's mob grazing, but all of these different names have a lot of similarities, and what we're doing is moving animals onto a paddock and off fairly quickly so that we can grow the most grass that we can. But we need that rotational grazing system to realize that potential. Rest and recovery is the key to forage yields. We need to give that grass time to rest and recover from being grazed. And if we don't, then we don't get the kind of productivity we'd like to have. So we want to harvest at the optimum time. We want to avoid overgrazing so that the animals aren't eating a second bite off that plant and taking it down really short. We want good fresh forage, increases animal intake. If the animals are in the same paddock for a length of time, more than 2 or 3 days, then a lot of the grass in that paddock is going to have been walked on, laid on, defecated on, peed on, and it's just not palatable. So we want to keep that forage as fresh and as desirable as possible to improve animal intake. If we have a shorter graze period, which means we have the animals more concentrated, we get better manure distribution, which gives us better nutrient recycling in the pasture and more even distribution across the pasture. And another big advantage of rotational grazing, you're working with your animals every day. They become much quieter and easier to manage. And so that, gives you a huge benefit when you have the animals looking to you to provide the forage, so they're waiting at the gate for the next move. Just a picture of a beef operation here in southern Ontario, fairly close to me. Just excellent operators. This picture's from a number of years ago, but the middle of May, lots of grass, high stocking rate on these pastures, and yet they get phenomenal production. They'll be on that pasture for one day and into another paddock for the next day. This graph kind of gives us a layout of how various forage species perform during the year. The green line is our tame grass legume mixtures, the type of mixtures that we would tend to seed down. And you can see that they're the most productive of all that we've got in our sort of arsenal of forages for grazing. We have a big production in May and June, and then it drops off in the heat of August. A little bit more growth in September, but certainly nothing like what we get in May, June period. And by early to mid-October, there's no growth left in those grass and legume species. The red line is native species, native grass species, and we get most of the production happening in May and June, early July. There's a huge summer slump and a little bit of fall growth in some cases. So the native species follow a similar pattern, but don't have the same recovery growth that we get from the tame species that we generally are. The blue line is the annual forages. So those would be forages, could be cereals, brassicas, annual ryegrass, planted in the late spring, early summer, and they'll give us production during late August, September, and into October. And that's the blue line. And then the hashed line stockpiled forages, we're stockpiling perennial forages where we let it grow from sometime in July or very early August through to the end of the growing season, which for us here in southern Ontario would be about the 20th of October. So we let the grass accumulate all fall, and then we graze it in November, December, and into January late in the season. So by using the annual forages and the stockpiled forages, we can supplement that later season slump if we're working with native species or with the tame species in the pasture. So that seasonal distribution pattern holds for basically everything. And we keep in mind that a lot of our pastures are going to produce about 60% of their productivity in that May, June, early July period. This is just showing grass growth. It's a schematic on the left-hand side of your screen. In the picture, we've got a young plant just starting to grow. And so it's taking a lot of energy from its root system. The photosynthesis in that plant is fairly low because it's got minimal leaf area. Growth is slow, and you can see the yield and quality lines. We've got, it is fairly high quality forage, but at the same time, the yield is very low. Then the second grass plant, growing much more vigorously. The second and third ones, the photosynthesis rate is high. There's lots of leaf area capturing sunlight. Their root reserves are being replenished. We've got rapid growth. And then we move into the flower and seeding phase where photosynthesis is slowed down. We've got energy being diverted from leaf growth into the seed head, and growth is much slower. At this stage, we've got high yield and low quality. So where we want to be is in that middle area where we've got the arrows showing best time to graze, which is when the plants are rapidly growing, seed heads haven't emerged yet, and we get good production, high quality forage for our livestock, and the plants can recover very quickly from being grazed. The root system of a plant is a mirror image of what's above ground. The leaves grow to sunlight, the roots grow to moisture, and as we take the leaf area off the top, we're going to lose the roots below because they've got very much of a complementary relationship. So you can see in this little schematic, we start out with a short plant. We've got a shallow root system. As the plant gets bigger, we have a much bigger root system comparable to what's above ground. We graze it off. We lose that root system because there isn't the leaf area above to provide the sugars and energy to keep the root system going. So we want to maintain a root system that can always continue to grow and reach moisture. If we take half the top off the plant, we don't do very much damage to the roots, but once we go beyond that 50%, we start to have a significant increase in the amount of root loss in the plant. So that's where we'll get into situations where we want to graze maybe a half to 2/3 at the very most of the forage that's available above ground, as long as we're leaving a reasonable residue so that we support the root system. Stock density is key to good utilization. We want a large number of animals in a relatively small area. It's kind of like being at the dinner table if you're a member of a large family, and when the food was passed along, you knew that if you passed by on something, the bowl would likely be empty before it came around to you again. Animals behave a lot the same way. They eat side by side. They eat everything that's in front of them. So we'll get better consumption of weeds and less desirable species, and we'll get more even grazing across the field. If there's a tremendous amount of space and a few animals, they will pick and choose, take what they like from one area and walk for a ways and then pick again, rather than grazing fairly evenly across the field. So stock density is the key in getting that good utilization. I think you want to think of the pasture field as a feed bunk. Too often I see people who manage their pastures more like an exercise yard, but manage it like a feed bunk. And there's lots of information on how to manage a feed bunk. We've got lots of research on optimum feed texture and nutrient balancing for feed bunk situations, whether it's dairy cattle, beef cattle, sheep. So in the feed bunk, we're wanting to provide fresh feed. We want the right texture and length. We want it nutrient balanced. We want easy access. So we want to do exactly the same thing in the pasture. It's a little different way of doing it, but we want to provide fresh feed, which we do through rotational grazing. We want the right texture and length so the animal can get a good bite. If the forage is really long and mature, they can't get a good bite. They need something that they can get a good mouthful when they stick their muzzle down into the forage and wrap their tongue around some forage to bring it in. And we want it nutrient balanced, which means plants that are in that rapid growth stage and ideally a mixture of grasses and legumes and easy access so that it's easy for them to get to. So think of the pasture as a feed bunk, and how you manage the feed bunk is similar to how you want to manage the pasture. This is a fairly busy schematic showing all the activities that are happening in a pasture field, where we've got activity in the soil with the soil microbes, breaking stuff down, making it available to the plants. The plants are eaten by the animals. So the benefits that we are included with a good grazing management plan: we have improved soil health, we have more microbes, increasing nutrient availability, we have improved forage yield, so we're providing rest and recovery and not overgrazing so that the plants can quickly grow and recover from the grazing. We have decreased input costs because less hay and stored feeds required. We get a longer grazing season. And what I have seen in my years in grazing extension work, somebody that does a good job of rotational grazing will get about 6 weeks longer grazing, especially in the late summer. And here in Southern Ontario, we run into a dry period in late July and August. And with a good rotational system, people have pasture available right through that period, whereas those that are set stocking and not rotating often are running out of feed in early July, mid-July, and just have to feed for another 6 weeks more than what somebody who's doing a good rotational grazing program. Because we get optimum forage growth, we'll be able to increase our carrying capacity, and we're providing some drought proofing for our pastures because we have strong, healthy plants with a good root system reaching to the moisture. In a management system and a design, we need lanes for animal movement, and that's going to depend on the system that you're using and what type of livestock you've got. If you're working with a dairy herd where they're moving 4 times through that laneway, twice a day for milking, in and out, you need a pretty substantial lane. You don't want to get into mud situations, so you need to have a firm footing, something that's fairly well drained, and that they can walk easily to the various paddocks. Same goes if you've got them returning to the barn or corral for water or management purposes on a frequent basis. You need a good laneway. If you have water in the field, you may not need the lanes very much, only to bring an animal in for market or medication or something. And those laneways then can be used also as a pasture area. There'll be very little traffic on them, so you're going to have forage there that can be grazed at various times. So depending on how much use that the laneway is going to get is going to have a big influence. In the diagram that we've got on the left is a pastured layout with 31 paddocks, and the way it's laid out, there's water available in every paddock, piped water, so there's fresh, clean water, and it's easy to move between paddocks and between the different areas, which makes it for an ideal grazing situation. With water, we want fresh, clean water available for our livestock. They will drink more water if it's fresh and clean, and drink out of a water trough. Cattle, their herding instinct means that they like to be within about 750 feet of the herd. If they have to go farther than that, they'll often go in groups, which means you need a larger water trough. Whereas if they're drinking individually, you don't need a very big trough to supply a lot of animals. But if they're walking a big distance, then you need a much more substantial water trough. If you're using surface water, I would highly recommend that you pump from that surface water into a trough. The picture here at the top of the screen, we've got cows in the water. They've pugged up around the shoreline. The water's very turbid or muddy. They're not going to drink as much of that kind of water as they would in the bottom picture where it's fresh and clean. And you also can run into health issues with really low quality water. If they're walking down a lane for water, you run the risk of congregating in the water trough area, and that means that you're going to get a lot of manure and urine in that area. It makes it more prone to foot rot problems, and you're putting all that nutrient around the water trough rather than out in the pasture field. So ideally, pipe water or at least pump water so that you've got fresh water available, which will increase water intake, which then increases forage intake and increases animal productivity. Pretty much the same here. We've got a couple of different water troughs. You can see they're not really that large, but when animals are drinking a couple at a time, they don't need to be that big of a water trough. So then we move to fences. And animals need to be trained to electric fence. Electric fence makes rotational grazing so much easier. And get them trained. Electric fence is a psychological barrier. So they need to know that if they touch that wire, it really hurts a whole lot more than the advantage they're going to get from what's on the other side of that fence. Your perimeter fence is to keep animals on your property. You likely will want 3 or more wires on a perimeter fence. And in some areas, there are local bylaws dictating what type of fence you need. And the type of livestock will influence the fence. If you've got quiet cows, that you may only need a couple of wires to keep cows and calves in. If you've got sheep, you're going to need more wires. If you've got a bunch of rowdy stocker steers, you may want more wires there just to increase the fence aspect to keep them where you want. So that's perimeter fence. Then internal fence, which creates our paddocks, is for animal management. So if we've got them trained to electric fence, a 1 or 2 wire electric fence will do the job for us. And we can set that up as a permanent fence where it remains in place for a long period of time. Or it could be semi-permanent, something that you may leave in place for 2 or 3 years and then move it. Or it could be very temporary in the sense that you put it up and take it down each time you're moving animals. So there's quite a range. That temporary fence may be used for 6 months or 3 or 4 months of the grazing season, or it may just be used for one move through a paddock. And then we have tumble wheels. Gallagher has a product called tumble wheel, which you see in the lower picture. And it's basically a 6-pronged wheel where the electric wire runs through the center hub. The 4 prongs that are not touching the ground are electrified. And the way the hub's designed, the 2 prongs on the ground are not electrified, so we don't short the fence out. And you just take one end of that fence, and the tumble wheels are placed about 75 feet apart. And you just take one end of the fence and move it down the paddock. The wheels tumble, and you then have created a new paddock without having to move posts, physically move posts, because they roll with the fence. So an easy way to increase the area or change the area that the animals are grazing. So those are the components of a grazing system. Then we need to know how much feed we need for our livestock. And working through a simple example here, 3% of body weight in dry matter intake is the number that we like to use to calculate how much dry matter our animals need. 3% is a little bit high for most situations, although if we have really high producing animals, they will eat a little bit more than that. It also allows for a wee bit of wastage in our estimations. So if we take the number of animals times the average weight times 3%, and I've got a simple example here. If I've got 10 cows averaging 1,200 pounds, that gives me 12,000 pounds of animal. 3% of 12,000 is 360 pounds. So I need, for my 10 cow herd, 360 pounds of dry matter per day. One of the things in doing this calculation, make sure you get your cow weights reasonably accurate. There are some people think they've got 1,200 pound cows that when they go across the scale are more like 1,500 pounds. So make sure you use fairly accurate weights for your animals. So we need for our 10 cows 360 pounds of dry matter per day. So how much forage do we have present and available? So we need to estimate how much forage is in that field. One way to do it is estimate if you were to make hay from that field at the point in time when you're going to go in and graze it. You could use a grazing stick, which you see the people here holding on to, and it's a very simple, basic way to estimate forage yield, taking the height and the thickness of the forage, and there's a table printed on the grazing stick to give you an idea of how many pounds of dry matter per acre inch you have in that type of forage. You can use a rising plate meter, and they come in various forms. Basically, a plate that you set on top of the forage gives you sort of an even density, and you measure the height then, and there's a chart that tells you how much dry matter is there. I have tried to use a rising plate meter. We have variable forages mixes in our pastures here in Ontario, and I find it very difficult to get anything that's could be considered a reasonable guesstimate. And the last way, and I would highly recommend that if you've not done this, you do this a few times to get an idea of what you're looking at, is do a scissor cut for some samples and calculate yield. So take a known area. I've used here a 1 square foot area, but it would be better to use something that's 2 or 3 square feet and do a number of samples across the field. Weigh it just on a gram kitchen scale, and you'll find that most of the time forage is in a good growing condition where we're not dealing with drought problems or excess of moisture, will be about 20% dry matter. So in this example I've got here, and I apologize, I work back and forth between metric and imperial, but I had 100 grams harvested off 1 square foot at 20% dry matter. That gives me 20 grams of dry matter. In an acre, we've got 43,560 square feet. So times 20 grams gives me 871 kilograms of forage dry matter on that acre. Or if you want to think in terms of pounds per acre, that's 1,916 pounds of dry matter per acre. So that, and if you do that a few times, and I know it's a bit inconvenient, but it lets you see how much forage is there when you're down on your hands and knees clipping it off. And it doesn't take too long to realize just the difference between a really good forage field and a not so good forage field. Excellent high quality pasture will have about 300 pounds of dry matter per acre inch of height. So for every inch of height in that pasture, there'll be about 300 pounds of dry matter. That's the best pasture you've ever seen type thing. Really, really dense, thick, lots of leaf growth. But that gives you an idea of the ideal. We want 4 inches of residual left behind. So although the pasture is 12 inches high and we're not measuring the highest leaf or whatever, we're kind of taking the general top of the field. But we do want to leave 4 inches of residual there so that there's leaf area to continue to photosynthesize and keep the plant going. So if we're using 8 inches of grazable in this example, we've got 2,400 pounds of dry matter available on an acre of that kind of pasture. If we've got a poor pasture, it's a thin pasture, you can see little bits of bare ground as you look down at it. It may have 50 pounds of dry matter per acre inch. So at 12 inches of height, that's 600 pounds of dry matter. And if we're going to leave 4 inches behind, we only have 400 pounds of dry matter in that field, which really isn't very much forage to work with. That hopefully will give you an idea of what to look at. If we've got a grass growth, when to start grazing, this is the other key part in the spring. When do we start grazing? We want to see 3-leaf stage on the grass plant. So the first arrow from the left, cool season grasses, you can see the grass plant there with 3 leaves emerged. That's when we should start grazing, not before that. If you want to leave it a little bit longer, that's not a problem. But if you graze at that 1-leaf stage, then there's going to be no replenishing of root reserves, and that's going to set that grass back significantly for the whole grazing season. So 3 leaves on our cool season grasses. Native grasses suggest 3.5 leaves. They just need a little more vigor to get going in the spring and to keep them going. So wait until the grass is well growing before you turn animals out on it. Also consider soil conditions. We don't want to turn animals out when the ground is really wet in the spring. So things need to be dried up enough that the animals are not pugging or punching up the pasture, and there needs to be at least 3 leaves on the grass plants. Also in your grazing plan, don't start in the same place each year. So if you've got a 30 paddock system, don't always start in paddock number 1 in the spring. You've started in number 1 this year, next year start in number 10 or number 20. Move around so that the plants have an opportunity in that spring season to get some extra growth if they've been grazed off in previous years in the spring period. So choose a different starting point each year in your paddock system. And you should do throughout the grazing season pasture inventory. So weekly or bi-weekly, do an inventory of all pastures, and it gives you a good indication of available forage going forward. It'll also alert you to underperforming paddocks, and it allows you to match forage resources to livestock requirements. So here's a graph where this one is figured out in ewe days, but you can do it in whatever way you want to, ewe days, cow days, or pounds of available forage in that paddock. So we've got, in this example, a 12 paddock system, and the last paddock grazed is number 12, and we're going back into paddock number 1. You can see that paddock number 3, for some reason, has not grown as well as paddocks 2 and 4. So we need to make some adjustments to that. And each situation will be a little bit different, but just by measuring this out, we know that when we go into paddock 1, in the second move from paddock 1, we're not going to have as much forage as we normally anticipated. Then if we look at paddocks 8, 9, and 10, something's happening there where they're not growing very well for us. So that's well out in our grazing system. It's ahead of us by 2 or 3 weeks or thereabouts, depending on how quickly we're moving. We can make some adjustment in our program so that we can meet the needs of the animals when they get to those paddocks. If we've got a paddock that's way ahead, we may take some hay off it, although in my mind, taking hay is cheating a little bit. You want to manage it as if you don't have any equipment and and use the animals as your harvesters at all times. Soil fertility is important in a pasture management system, and the major components of the soil fertility is pH, and you can see in this schematic on the right-hand side, as we get down in the low pH numbers, the 4, 4.5, and 5, a lot of the elements are not nearly as available as they are in that 6.5 to 7.5 pH range. And the same when we get in the top end up in that 8.5. We see that copper, boron, manganese, iron aren't as available in range. So if your pH is outside of that sort of 6 or 6.5, to certainly bring those 4s and 5s up into that 6 range. Nitrogen is important to keep the grasses growing. It's kind of the gas in the gas tank, so to speak, of plant growth. So we need enough nitrogen there. If you've got an all grass pasture, you're going to get a good response to applying nitrogen. My observation, 45 pounds of actual nitrogen per each grass growth cycle. So, and the grass growth cycle is about 30 to 40 days. So on a number of applications of nitrogen, do keep in mind rainfall to take that nitrogen down into the soil. Applying it is going to leave a lot of that nitrogen on the surface, and it will volatilize off. Potassium, basic elements for plant growth, and we want to have a medium soil test for those elements. We also want to check for magnesium and sulfur and have them in that mid-range. Our pastures don't have real high fertility, but at the same token, we've got to have adequate fertility there to grow the grasses. It's the same as when you forage and feed for the livestock very well, but they don't have to carry out photosynthesis and their growth. In a pasture, we want a mixture of. I really like alfalfa because of its high productivity. It does have a risk float, but it also is very productive. Sainfoin has received some interest, especially in Western Canada in the last grams. And sainfoin is a non-bloating, very similar alfalfa in a number of ways, and if you can mix some same mix stand, then you get the benefits of the alfalfa at the same time reducing the risk of bloat. Clovers are excellent pasture legumes, especially white clover, but the other clovers, and there's quite a variety of clovers, all can work well in a pasture system. Trefoil does really well in a grazing system if you can give it a long recovery time and time to set seed at some point during the year. And it's slow to start growing in the spring, and recovery time is slower than some of the other legumes. There's some vetches growing. Often we see them in southern Ontario just growing wild in the field. They're a good legume. We don't very often seed them, but if they're there, certainly make good use of them. To complement the legumes, we want grasses, and orchard grass is my preferred pasture grass. It starts to grow early in the spring. It grows fairly rapidly, has really good recovery time once it's grazed off. And once the seed head's removed from the plant, that first seed head, then it stays leafy for the rest of the growing season and continues to grow leaves rather than trying to put out another seed head. Meadow brome is an excellent grass for a pasture. another bunch grass like orchard grass, but it can do very well in pastures. Rye grasses, both the annuals and the perennials, if you've got lots of moisture and good soil fertility and the winters aren't too severe, the ryegrass is certainly have the highest sugars of all the grasses, and they do really well in the areas where the climate is suitable for them. The fescues, tall fescues, likely the main grass pasture one that we use, but there are a couple of others like creeping red fescue. You want to be aware of endophyte problems with some of the fescues, but again, a very resilient grass, and fescues are excellent for stockpile grazing. So the leaf is fairly leathery texture-wise, and it holds up and stays green late into the season and well into the winter. So if you've got cows rooting through snow to find grass to eat and they find a green fescue plant, although they weren't real keen on it maybe in the summertime, it's pretty neat to find some fresh green feed under a layer of snow, and it works extremely well in that type of situation. So depending on your situation, you combine the legumes and the grasses to give you a very productive and healthy pasture. Just a little bit on grazing alfalfa. It's the most productive legume we have, partly because there's been really strong breeding programs to develop it. It's the principal legume and forage for stored forage. It's deep-rooted, has pretty good drought tolerance or dry weather tolerance, and it provides its own nitrogen as well as extra for the grasses. The challenge is bloat risk, and paloxylene, which is available in two products, Alpha Sure, which is a liquid, goes through the water system, and Bloat Guard, which is a dry product that you need to feed through a little bit of grain or through salt. But with both these products, you need a daily dose into the animals, but a very good way to prevent bloat and let you make good use of high quality alfalfa. If you're grazing alfalfa, you need frequent moves. You've got to keep the animals full, provide a little bit of dry, fairly coarse hay for them to nibble on to provide a bit of scratch in their stomach, and don't move animals when the forage is wet. So don't move in the morning when there's a heavy dew. Move at midday when the forage is dry. That seems to help considerably in reducing the amount of frothing that takes place in the rumen and results in the bloat problems. But certainly for high productivity, if you want dairy cows to produce, or you're trying to fatten steers or beef heifers, alfalfa is certainly one to look at very seriously. It will have some challenges with winter kill at times, and it's not as long-lived as some of the other legumes, but the productivity is just exceptional. To complement our grazing perennial pastures and our grazing program, we can graze some annuals. And if you remember back to the graphs I had at the beginning, the annuals can provide some early spring grazing when we use winter cereals. So planted in September or early October, they grow through the fall, live over the winter, and then start growing early in the spring. That can give you, particularly with cereal, rye works well for this type of scenario. And that lets you rest your perennial pastures for an extra week or two in the spring and lets them become a little bit stronger for the growing season. Spring cereals and corn for late summer and fall grazing can provide fall rest for our perennial pastures. When we can graze spring cereals in that September-October period, corn I've found works really well as a grazing forage. It can be grazed from mid-August through to December and beyond, depending on when you want to make use of it, and very productive and can work well in a grazing system where you're using annuals to get some rest for your perennial pastures and to complement that summer slump and less growth in the fall. And there's been big interest in the last few years in annuals as a second crop for fall grazing. I've got corn and sorghum Sudan grass here that if you can get them planted early enough, they need to go in late June or early July. We'll give you some fall grazing after you've taken off, say, a hay crop. You could use those, or we'll also use brassicas and cereals where we've taken a winter wheat crop off. For us, it means harvesting sometime in late July or really early August. Go right back in with some spring cereals and some mixed with maybe some brassicas, and that'll give you some fall growth in late September and October that can complement your other pastures and provide some extra forage in your grazing system. Just for winter grazing, swath grazing and bale grazing. Swath grazing works well if you're in a dry climate. It does not work in Eastern Canada or Eastern United States, where we have fairly warm falls with a reasonable amount of moisture. So if you swath something and leave it out in the fall, it's just going to mold and rot on you. But if you're in an area of fairly dry environment, likely less than 20 inches of precipitation in the year, and winter comes on fairly quickly, planting some cereals a little bit later than normal, then swathing them in mid to September, and then using them for grazing after snowfall. And you can see in the bottom picture, using some tumble wheels and giving this group of cows some of the swaths. They're going to root through the snow and find where the swath is, so they've got an accumulation of forage, and that can work fairly well in those situations where you've got a dry, cool fall and fairly quick move into the winter. Bale grazing is kind of a similar idea, but we make our forage into bales and then put it into a bale yard or spot the bales across the field. The top picture, you can see the circles where bales have been placed. I would really like to see those bales placed about 30 feet apart in a grid pattern, and then you use electric fence to allocate a few bales at a time for your livestock, maybe moving about every 3 days or 4 days to fresh bales. And that way you're not starting equipment every day. You've got the bales placed late in the fall, and then it's just a matter of moving an electric fence and giving them access to some more bales. So you reduce your yardage costs. You've got manure in the field with both of these systems, so you don't have manure to haul. You've got the nutrients in the field. So just ways to extend the grazing season and reduce the time that you might have animals yarded up and feeding stored forage in a yard situation. So to keep your pastures healthy, we want to capture the sunlight with green, healthy plants. We want to fence to provide livestock management, so we have our animals grazing where we want them. We want water readily available in all paddocks. We want high stock density and frequent moves. We want legumes and grasses in our pastures. We want adequate fertility for good plant growth. We want to use annual stockpiled forage and crop residues to our advantage. And we want to keep some pasture records so we have information that allows us to improve our management. If we don't have records, how are we going to know what happened last year? And just, our grazing season here is about 150 days. So if there's 3 days difference, that has a significant impact in what your returns are, just in the percentage aspect. So we need records to know where we're at. And most importantly, rest and recovery time for the pastures so that they can recover from grazing and produce more forage for us. So in a rotational grazing system, some of the sticking points that I've had given to me over the years, takes too long to set up fence. Well, if you've got animals trained to electric fence, you can set up a temporary electric fence as fast as you can walk across the field and back. Or I've seen people build fence off an ATV and they're going a whole lot faster than they could walk, but they've mastered holding onto a reel and putting posts in the ground. So if there's a will, there's a way, and you can put fence up very fast. The capital investment, perimeter fence is the largest cost. Internal fence is a fraction of your total cost. And if you want to maximize your or improve your pasture productivity, the first thing that you should plant is fence posts. And if you got a pasture you want to improve, plant fence posts. Don't tear it up and reseed it and try and start over again. If you don't rotationally graze, you're going to end up exactly where you started before. So put in fence posts and manage that grazing. And it's going to take a year or two to see results. And it takes a bit of time for the forage species to improve and thicken up, but over time you'll see a significant increase in the productivity. I've had people tell me they've got anywhere from 25 to 100% improvement in their pasture productivity by moving to a rotational grazing system. Focus on the livestock. So often people get focused on the livestock and not on the forage. Livestock are the harvesters. You as a rancher or farmer are producing forage and marketing it as meat and milk. So your key productivity is on your forage. Use the animals to market that forage. And you may not see a big improvement in animal performance, but what you'll see is an increase in stocking rate or a longer grazing period and reduced stored forage usage. So that's where your big benefit comes. And then the last thing is blame the weather and suggest you can't do anything about it. But if you manage your forage, you'll be able to weatherproof your pastures quite significantly. And a quote here from Hugh Aljo from the Hay and Forage Grower: the best time to start planning for a drought is when it is raining. And so often people wait till their pastures look like this picture and say, what can I do? Well, the grasses are mature. We're late in the growing season. There isn't anything you can do at this point. But if you had taken some steps earlier in the year, you could have had a lot more forage there available, because you grow the maximum of forage when you've got good growing conditions. So keep informed. We've got a few sources of information here. In Canada, we've got passionforpasture.ca, which is a Gallagher website. In the US, it's passionforpasture.com. We're on Facebook as Passion for Pasture, and we're on Twitter at Passion for Pasture. And both Cody Dvorak and I monitor both the Twitter and the Facebook, and I myself, I use Twitter a fair bit. If you've got questions there, we'll try and respond to them. And Maya Grazing, their website is here, and they have good pasture management information and ways of collecting information. And I think, yes, that's my last slide. So Alex, I'll turn it back to you.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Jack. A lot of great information there. Some key points that I took away were pasture inventory, doing those assessments weekly or bi-weekly. The second point was don't start the same paddock at the start of each season, each year for your grazing plan. And the third point was around capital investment and also expectation of results. I think that's a very good point about understanding that it does take up to 2 years to start to see some of those improvements through changing your management approach. We did have a couple of questions. Just quickly, I'll prior to going to those questions, I will show a couple of slides just on Maya. 1 second, and then we'll jump into those questions. So as I mentioned earlier, we've been working with Gallagher for around 18 months now. So My Grazing, what we do, we have two products. The focus is on grazing management. So everything that Jack talked about there, you can generally do within the application. It captures all of those records, observations, and also allows you to forecast based on that historical data going forward. So just quickly, there are two products. One's our light product. It's all self-service. You do your own onboarding. Then we have our professional product, which comes with one-on-one unlimited grazing support. For anything from how do I create a move, how do I complete a pasture assessment and input that data in the application, to our support staff working with you to optimize your graze plan. That's available across all devices, desktop, iPad, or tablet or smartphone. You can access that data anywhere, anytime, and it works offline. The product looks like this on the mobile application. So we have our farm map, we have our dashboard with some key metrics, and then we have an example, a screenshot of how to create a move, add in a pasture assessment, observations, etc., etc. So that is what I might do is I'll switch you back to presenter, Jack, as I may need you to go back through some of your presentation. We had a couple of questions. One here was from Sam, and it says, for your scissor cuts, do you mind explaining in a bit more detail how this works? I'm fairly new to grazing management.
So take a set area, square foot, 2 or 3 square feet, whatever, and just take a pair of scissors or garden shears and cut the grass off like you were giving it a haircut. Gather it up in a plastic bag and take it in and weigh it on your kitchen scales. It's that simple. I don't know how else to explain it. I hope that answers your question.
I think that's right. I guess for unimproved or native pastures or rangelands where there might be a bit more variance in pasture growth, taking maybe a couple of cuts and ensuring that your sample's fairly representative of your population, would that be a better approach in a different environment?
Important. And that's important in any environment, because there's going to be variation across the field, no matter how dense or thin the forage is. So you really need to do several samples, 5, 6, 7 samples across the field to get an idea of how much is there. Part of that is to get an estimate, and it also gets you thinking in terms of how many pounds of forage is available for the livestock just by looking at it. Develop a grass eye, the ability to look at a field and estimate the yield. It's kind of like looking at an animal and saying it weighs 900 pounds or it weighs 1,000 pounds. And with a bit of experience, then you get so you can do 925 and 1,050.
Perfect. Thanks, Jack. I'm just conscious of time, so we'll ask one more question. Soil fertility. This is much the same as the scissor cuts question. How often do you test, and do you have any tips for getting that right?
So soil test, I would say every 3 to 5 years, and sample areas that you're going to manage basically the same and are similar in soil type and soil structure. So likely sampling in a 25 to 40 acre size would be the maximum size that I would do one sample from. And you want to take soil samples to a depth of 4 inches, core samples. They tell us that you should take 1 to 2 samples per acre and do a representative grid pattern across the field, and use a local lab. And by local, I mean provincial or state or whatever, close to you, because the labs are geared to the type of soil that's in their general area. So if I'm here in Southern Ontario and take a soil sample and send it to California for analysis, totally different soils that they're used to working with. So the results are not going to be meaningful. So I need to send the sample to a lab here in Ontario. Somebody in California needs to send the sample to a lab in California. But once you've got the base results back, and if there are no major problems, then I would say every 3 to 5 years would be a good idea to check and see that fertility isn't getting out of line or depleted in some area.
Great, thanks, Jack. Well, we might wrap it up there, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much for your time. As I said earlier on at the start of the presentation, you will all receive a follow-up email with links to the Passion for Pastures websites, both Canadian and US websites, and from there you will be able to identify your closest Passion for Pastures dealer. Jack has a wealth of knowledge, but the good thing is he's trained all of those dealers, so that has been passed on, and they will be a great resource for you that you can access and extract the wealth of knowledge that Jack has. Within that email, you'll also have a link to the My Grazing website. So if you'd like to do a trial of our professional grazing product or sign up to our free product, you'll have those links within that email. But thanks very much, everyone. Have a good evening, and I hope to see you in our next webinar. Cheers.